Hi, Awande. Can you introduce yourself briefly?
Hi, my name is Awande Buthelezi. I am an activist with the Climate Justice Charter Movement and a member of the National Coordinating Committee of the Climate Justice Charter Movement.
Are you also a researcher? No.
Yes, I'm a researcher and organizer with the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center, COPAC for short.
And what's been your main area of research?
My main area of research has been particularly around alternatives, climate and eco-social alternatives, with a particular focus on economic and macroeconomic issues.
Okay, and in the Climate Justice Charter movement, you've been around ever since it started or more recently?
So my relationship with the Climate Justice Charter movement began as a master's student at the University of the Witwatersrand, Wits University for short, where I engaged as a student. And from there, during the conception of the charter, I then began more formally involved within the processes of the charter, its formation, before we became a proper movement.
Okay, I'll get back to you on the issue of what's the proper movement actually mean. But as a young person, as a youth growing up in South Africa, for you, what's specially important about the Climate Justice Charter movement?
I think the importance of the Climate Justice Charter movement for me, particularly as a young person who's grown up in post-apartheid South Africa, is that it is a movement centered on hope and trying to create a message that speaks to the scale of our social crises, but also speaks to the scale of a crisis such as the climate crisis, which is not being fully realized or understood currently. So we're not only focused on the crises considered or put together by the context of the past, but also crises that we're currently contributing to and will affect most disproportionately those who aren't even born yet.
And is this also a crisis of livelihoods and like the future that you or other young people see in terms of even just getting jobs or dignified livelihoods?
I think that question speaks particularly to being what I believe what it means to be a climate justice activist within the context of the Global South. In that all of our issues with regards to our socio-economic context, inequality, wealth disparity, and the wider gap of our aspirations in the post-colonial context is also captured within the context of the climate crisis. So that speaks to youth unemployment, it speaks to socio-economic and other social crises.
Okay, and so in the last maybe 2 or 3 years, what have been the sort of main changes or new directions or advancements in the Climate Justice Charter movement?
Well, I would say in particular the two biggest changes is the formulation of the Climate Justice Charter movement as a movement. First as a coming together of different groups and social justice and climate justice forces around the putting together of a charter, but now into a movement that pushes the alternatives and the perspectives that are found within the charter. And second, I would say, is the formulation and drafting of the climate justice deal process, which takes the aspirations and alternatives and perspectives laid out in the charter, but tries to bridge out and create a more material and concrete roadmap about what those perspectives mean in terms of what they would look like once instituted in society.
Now, I think one of the biggest challenges to any such thing is the sort of macroeconomic and macro political structures that we have, right? So how do you hope to deal with those? What's the vision for the larger picture?
Well, the climate justice deal in that perspective in the macroeconomic picture is informed by the values and the principles of the charter, which is to create an earth-centered approach and conception of what it means to be human. So that means coming to bear or coming to grips with what has led us to where we are right now, the history of colonialism and apartheid in the South African context in particular, but also the context of the past 4 decades of neoliberalism that has created these crises that we're currently facing, so the polycrisis, as some would prefer to term it. And what this perspective, this climate justice perspective, can contribute into understanding and approaching this is that we need new life-affirming and eco-centric measures of what societal progress and societal well-being looks like. For us in the Charter, that is more easily understood in the 14 systemic alternatives, but more broadly speaking, in how we look at our societal and economic ways of addressing the climate crisis, in the Charter, what we're trying to do is move beyond just simply understanding as mitigation and adaptation. And what we're proposing and what we're seeking to work with is a conception of transformative decarbonization instead of just mitigation, transformative adaptation, and transformative regeneration. And these perspectives, we believe, speak more to the complexity and the context of what our society is currently framed in and what it's going to face in the context of the climate crisis.
So one of the things that I think across the global south we feel is that sometimes as environmental groups or human rights groups or whatever we think of ourselves, we tend to adapt the language from that's coming from the West, right? So how is the climate justice charter movement sort of locating itself within the historical, cultural, spiritual, material context of South Africa itself?
I think that's part of the challenge, but also the excitement of why the Charter, I believe, is a project of hope, in that to confront our context, to be able to provide some kind of perspective towards what future we must move towards, means also confronting our history. And that means grappling fundamentally with the colonial legacies of our current society. So we do not necessarily shy away from the fact that to pursue a path which deals fundamentally with what that colonial context has wrought in our society, particularly in the South African sense, and the way in which our country is deeply embedded and tied to coal as a fossil fuel, and the history of coal and the history of mining as being the material means through which our colonial society was constructed. That is very central to our climate justice perspective. So when I speak of transformation in terms of transformative decarbonization, adaptation, and regeneration, it means speaking directly to transforming those relations, those relationships, and those material constructs that have been created from that colonial context. So that's why we use that language of transformation and transformational politics, is to speak directly to the need to transform our societies beyond the context of what we created or was created for us in the colonial context.
What are the sort of main challenges that you face, and what steps are you proposing in the future to try and overcome these?
I would say the first main step that we have faced and do face, and we've kind of touched on it, but to square it more or to get to it more directly, is that the concept of climate justice and climate justice politics in the context of South Africa, and I think more broadly in the global south, is quite a difficult one to put forward when we're faced with a number of other challenges, socioeconomic ones that we were speaking about earlier. And this is why I say that I believe it's the role and responsibility of climate justice activists in the global south to speak directly to how climate connects to that, is because it's our responsibility as those who are engaged in climate justice struggles to show society and others who are already engaged in those struggles how they're already engaged in those struggles, so that we can then form those kind of linkages and connections to take these steps more proactively forward, to decisively kind of deal with them. So I would say that's fundamentally the main struggle that we face in our activism, particularly because it's also used against us by the forces who would like to maintain the status quo, whether that be fossil fuel embedded forces, or just the political and economic forces that are also invested in things being the way that they are.
What about political parties? Is there any political party at all that is open to something like the climate justice charter movement?
I'd say, unfortunately, in our context, I do not believe that is the case. Very early in the formation of our movement and the work of the Charter, we took the Charter to Parliament. And in that process and exercise of taking our Charter to Parliament, we engaged with all the political parties who are represented in the South African Parliament to open up a space for them to come and also give their perspectives around the climate crisis and how they would feel about the perspectives that the Climate Justice Charter is putting forward and how their party also speaks to those things. Unfortunately, only 3 parties represented in all the parties that were in our last parliament prior to our current elections responded to us. And all the rest responded after the fact, sending apologies for not being in attendance. And if that was not enough for us at the time to understand where they stand on these issues, I think the most recent election in particular was a clear, decisive picture of where climate politics, climate emergency, and climate justice are located within our political landscape. And it's right at the bottom in terms of their priorities. And I think there's no better way of that being surmised than in the fact that just a week or so after our elections took place, we had a major rainfall rain bomb event that hit the province of KwaZulu-Natal off the coast, off our eastern coast, and political parties were, left quite starkly bare in terms of they did not speak to this issue, and it's quite a clear distinction in terms of how reality hit just after this political moment in which the space was available for climate politics to be center stage, which it was not.
So, given this situation, which is probably true for most parts of the world, would you agree that we need to kind of move much more towards radical democracy, like where people themselves have the power to decide on what's happening on the ground, and of course force the government to do what it's supposed to be doing, but not depend on the government for all these things?
Yeah, 100%. And I believe that is also a foundational value and principle within the Climate Justice Charter, but also within the movement itself. The Climate Justice Deal document, which I spoke about, as a process also seeks to put forward these perspectives in a way which speak to how communities and workers can implement these alternatives and these programs in their workplaces and in their communities outside of the state. But obviously that means there is still a role for the state. And we see ourselves working with, beyond, and against the state when we have to. And that speaks to the true nature of what reality is and the complexity of the scale of the crisis that we face. We can't wait for the state to do it. We have to be able to capacitate ourselves, and that's where true transformative adaptation takes place, in being able to create that resilience from the ground up.
Thanks, Awande. I think from whatever I know of what's happening in the world, I think the South African Climate Justice Charter movement is well ahead of most of the rest of the world in terms of trying to bring together different perspectives and different sections of society, even if the government may not be listening, at least from the people's point of view. So congratulations for that. All the best, and I hope we can also learn from what's happening here.
Thank you, and I hope that this can help contribute to the wider perspectives that are coming up from people all over the world in trying to confront this crisis.
Thanks, Awande. Thank you.
Thank you.